I think that the province of British Columbia has been a leader in thinking about how to adapt forest management to climate change. Is there more to be done? Absolutely. One approach fits all isn't going to work because we need to practice adaptive management. Our department has people working on issues, everything from forest management to conservation biology, and we teach students in natural resources conservation, in forest management, and in forest sciences. We also conduct research on all kinds of issues to do with the management and conservation of our ecosystems. So it's quite a broad-ranging set of subjects, and climate change touches all of those subject areas.
The world itself is its own ecosystem with its own subsets, and everything is connected. And here in British Columbia, we have a connection to both the largest ocean and also some of the largest forests, ecosystems. Could you tell me a little bit about how those two play into one another and affect each other?
Yeah, so I think both the forests and the oceans, they certainly interact. Our climate is very much modified by the Pacific Ocean, and we're seeing big changes in the Pacific Ocean that are affecting our weather, that are having big effects on our terrestrial ecosystems. This year we're seeing very warm waters off the Pacific that are resulting in drought in British Columbia, in a lot of new heat records, and putting a lot of the forests that I study under considerable stress. It's also interesting, I think, to note that both the ocean and the forests contain huge stores of carbon, and temperatures directly affect how much carbon is stored, how much is sequestered, and how much is given off, depending on how healthy those systems are.
Could you talk a little bit more about carbon stored in forests and then also the various ways in which it's released?
Yeah, of course, trees are partially defined by having a main stem that is made of wood. And wood is about 50% carbon. And our trees are about the most efficient scrubbers of carbon from the atmosphere that we have. So a healthy tree will take up carbon dioxide and then will grow, and it will store carbon in the stem, in branches, in the roots, etc. But an unhealthy tree or an unhealthy forest will start to give off that carbon. So as trees die or parts of trees die back, they will then rot and they will give off that stored carbon.
Could you explain a little bit about how wildfires and also other insects and animals can play into this?
So we're seeing big changes in our forests, and of course disturbance is a natural part of all of these ecosystems. So coastal forests, the main disturbance agent would be windstorms and very rare fires. In more continental, more interior areas, we'd have more frequent fires that would be the main disturbance agents. Of course, when we have a fire burn, it kills trees, gives off a lot of carbon dioxide, but a new forest starts after that point, and we have many fire-adapted species. With fires, which is not my area of expertise, we're seeing a number of changes. So first of all, humans have been very effective at suppressing fires. We've learned to be very good forest fire fighters, and that has created a set of problems. It's created large areas of forest that probably should have burned more frequently that haven't burned. And so when they do burn, there's a lot of fuel, and there's a lot of opportunity with increased temperatures and decreased rain for very large-scale fires. So we expect to see the frequency and intensity of fires increasing. But what we also see is that warming, drying conditions leave trees more stressed and less able to fight off insects and diseases that impact them. So we see all kinds of mortality and injury in the forests increasing in frequency as the trees become stressed and as conditions become more favorable for the insects. In British Columbia, we've seen the mountain pine beetle epidemic, and it is absolutely massive. It killed over about 15 million hectares of forests and swept through a very abundant food source for the beetle during years that winter temperatures were not low enough to kill many of those beetles. And so that really impacted our forests, but it impacted communities that rely on those forests. It impacted people who work in the forest industry, who rely on timber supply for their jobs, for their communities' economic drivers, and it left huge areas of forest in poor shape. But that also provided the canary in the coal mine in a lot of ways for British Columbia to take on serious climate action. We were the first jurisdiction in North America to have a carbon tax directly as a result of the mountain pine beetle epidemic. When you talk to people who are foresters, the vast majority are very concerned about climate change and the impacts on forests. And we're seeing other insects and disease follow suit. There are many that are now impacting the health of forests here and elsewhere in the world through combined effects of increased temperatures and, in many areas, increased drought.
You are a geneticist. And I think that one of the things that I certainly didn't necessarily realize at first, and that people might not pay attention to, is, trees are capable of reacting and growing in similar ways to like the rest of life. Could you give us more of an in-depth idea of how trees might be able to, let's say, fight off an invasive species or adapt to different changes in the environment?
For any species, when faced with a change in the environment, whether it's a change in climate or a change in pests or pathogens or another competitor, there's basically just a few options. And as a geneticist, we think in terms of populations, not in terms of individuals. So an individual can react by changing its behavior, but a population can adapt through natural selection or adapt through migration, or we can lose populations in the face of those kinds of changes. So trees are interesting because they have very long lifespans and they're adapted to dealing with variable climates over years because they have these long lifespans, and unlike an animal, they can't move easily, they can't run and hide, so they can tolerate some range of changes in conditions, but when you exceed that range, then you start running into problems. They have high levels of genetic diversity, so some individuals in a population may be able to tolerate conditions quite different than they exist in now, but it might not be that many individuals. So you might still have species persisting, but not really a healthy forest persisting through that process. In terms of migrations, we already know that many species of animals and plants are shifting their distributions as a response to climate change. Trees can't do that quickly because a seed has to disperse. It has to land in a place where it can germinate and grow. And then it takes 10 or 20 or 30 years before that tree is mature enough to start producing seed on its own, and those have to disperse. And for most of our species, the seed doesn't move very far. So the ranges that species can shift is maybe 100 or 200 meters per year based on records since the last ice age. And climates are moving at a rate of something like 7 kilometers per year horizontally. The trees can't possibly keep up. So this presents a challenge. How do we help them do that? And should we help them to do that?
How have we been furthering that research in a way that is responsible and for the benefit of the ecosystem as much or more so than for the industries and the people that interact with them?
Yeah. Trees face large challenges because of their lifespans and being stuck in one place. There are some things that we can do, and in British Columbia alone, we plant about 250 million trees a year. We have forest nurseries that grow those trees. We have armies of young people that go out and plant those trees. And we have policies that specify what you can plant where on public lands, which are the vast majority of our forest lands. So we have a system in place that we need to adjust around these new challenges. And so with climate change, with adapting what we plant to climate change, we have a couple of choices. One thing that we can do is increase the diversity of what we plant. increase species diversity, so plant multiple species, because we don't know which ones are going to do well and which ones are going to do poorly. We can maintain or increase genetic diversity so that for any given species that we plant, we can take some seeds from warm, dry places where we know the trees are adapted to warmer, drier conditions. And we can take some seeds from places in the local area we're planting that sort of represent that historical genetic composition in that area. And so we can increase genetic diversity and use that natural genetic diversity to help adapt those forests. And another thing that we can consider doing is bringing in new species. So helping species ranges expand and planting things that weren't already present there. We have to be very careful about that because we know that moving species around historically has led to big plant invasions that have created other problems. So there's a big difference between, say, moving something just a little farther north or a little up in elevation, not far from where it's historically existed, and, say, moving something very long distances across continents, between continents, where the risk of unexpected consequences is much higher. But I think anytime we're changing the species composition, it's a much bigger question than changing the genetic composition from an ecological standpoint. But we could also say, oh, all of these things carry risk. We shouldn't change anything. And I think the reality is that we have changed the climate already, and the projections are of it changing to such a great extent that we really have to evaluate the risks of doing something against those risks of doing nothing, which are quite substantial. But we need good research on all of these areas, and above all, we need mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions to slow the process of climate change and to give our ecosystems a chance to adapt.
So when you talk about genetics of trees, is this coming from just simply taking seeds from trees that already exist, or are there any kinds of work that's being done to create certain kinds of hybrids or ones that are resistant to certain kinds of traits?
So there's a few different things that are done. In Western Canada, people are working with natural genetic variation, so there is no effort underway with genetic modification techniques. It's important that that's sort of a clear message out of this. The reality is that the traits that are involved in synchronizing the growth of a tree with the climate it occupies involve many, many genes. And genetic modification is a single gene approach. And so we don't have single genes that are going to give us a silver bullet for climate change. But what nature's given us is we have tree species that exist over very wide areas. So for example, many of our tree species here in British Columbia extend down to California, and they may extend to Idaho, Montana, Wyoming in the US, Washington, Oregon, etc. Other species go from here up to the Yukon and Northwest Territories. So we've got these species that inhabit these broad ranges of climatic conditions, and so natural selection in those places has adapted those local populations to different conditions than we have here. And if we can find locations that have historically had the conditions we expect to have here in the coming decades, then those provide us with a very great genetic resource. And we can think about collecting seeds from those areas. Another thing that goes on is that there are tree breeding programs for the most planted species in British Columbia, and they put experiments out in a range of climatic conditions, and they see which trees have offspring that do well. And then they will use those parent trees to get seed for reforestation. And so we've done quite a bit of work looking at the natural populations, the populations that are in the tree breeding programs, and comparing them in terms of climate adaptation. It's also very important, and it's required in legislation, that those breeding programs maintain high levels of genetic diversity. So for example, the selected material in a tree breeding program has much higher levels of diversity than most agricultural crops that are being planted, in recognition of the fact that these live over very long periods of time and that we don't want to reduce the genetic base.
As we're getting more data and more metrics on climate disruption, we're seeing that what we are likely to expect is a lot more variability. And you were mentioning before that experimenting with bringing trees up from, California that are, used to more dry conditions. Yet there's also a chance that there might be 1 year in between, let's say a period of 10 or something, where we get the most rain we've seen. How does that factor into the analysis and the research?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So in temperate regions, this wouldn't apply, say, in the tropics or subtropics, we see that the genetic differences among locations are really driven by adaptation to cold conditions. So how long is the frost-free growing season? What are the minimum temperatures experienced in the winter? And the tree's growth and dormancy periods need to be very synchronized with those frost-free periods. So we need to make sure we keep track of things like that, because with increased variability, we expect a lot more heat waves and droughts, but we can also get years where we get extreme cold. And just this past fall in British Columbia, there was a cold event where the weather had been very mild, milder than usual, hadn't sent the right signals to trees, and then the temperature dropped. And many seedlings were killed by those cold events. So when we're testing seedlings in our experiments, we grow seedlings here in controlled growth chamber environments where we can control temperature and moisture and light, and we can even control CO2 if we want to. And we test them for heat stress, we test them for drought stress, but we also test them for frost hardiness, cold hardiness. And we're trying to get an overall look at their ability to withstand extremes. And it's important we think about that. And that's why planting a diversity both of species and of genetic material is so important, because if some of the trees we plant are susceptible to a given event, we don't want all of them to be susceptible, because we still want to have a forest. The other thing is that we have some areas that are historically climatically more variable than others. And so we can look at those through an evolutionary lens, put them through our testing program and say, do the trees coming from these areas have higher levels of genetic diversity? Have they been selected through natural selection to deal with more fluctuations in climate? And do we want to start looking at those areas to see if we can get valuable genetic material from those areas that's pre-adapted to these sort of uncertain conditions? You bring up hybridization. Well, in nature, a lot of tree species hybridize a lot. So what we find is where two species from the same genus, like two pines or two spruces, come into contact with each other, you get an area of hybridization. And we find that within those sorts of areas, we seem to find trees that are very robust and resilient, and that there's a lot of genetic diversity within that area of hybridization for adaptation to other conditions. So they offer potentially a very valuable natural resource for forests that can withstand these kinds of conditions.
How does your department work with industry to show them what these new challenges are and help them work towards a more sustainable forest?
It's really important that when we do research, we translate that into action and we make information available to the people who are really managing the resource on the ground. And it's true that forestry is an important industry, and we have many communities where people are nearly entirely dependent economically on the forest and on the forest industry. At the same time, we've got to balance that against conservation, and we need large conservation areas. We've had agreements in BC that have set aside large areas for conservation. We've got our protected areas strategy with parks and protected areas that are very important to maintain habitat for species. But climate change is presenting challenges for those too, because habitat that might have been high quality for a given species at one point might not be now. And so bringing climate change into management of those areas is very challenging. We certainly have people working on that with the conservation managers out on the land base. We've got to work in all these areas because we expect so many things from our forests. We expect habitat for animals and for other plant species, areas that humans can recreate. Dead forests aren't much fun to recreate in. The state of the forests has a direct impact on the well-being of people, and that is a growing area of research. We have the need for building materials, for wood, for paper, for all the things that we use wood fiber for, and often wood fiber represents a more environmentally friendly material than the substitutes. So do you want to build a building out of wood or out of steel? Well, the wood is going to have a much lower carbon footprint, but we have to grow that wood in a sustainable manner, harvest it in a sustainable manner, etc. So we've got to think about these things. We're expecting all these things, and we really have to balance how we use those forests with how much we conserve. It's very challenging. A now retired colleague of mine, Dr. Fred Bunnell, he's a wildlife biologist by training, and he said, forestry isn't rocket science. It's much more complicated than that. So
I'm starting to learn that right now. So I know that this isn't necessarily your field of study, so maybe you can just give me kind of like a general idea. But you know, there's been a change in the way that forests have been logged and cut down. It's kind of changed from cutting up blocks, and now it looks like a golf course almost, right? Where you're seeing stands of trees, more a specific type of layout based off the land. Could you talk about why that matters?
Yeah, that is definitely outside my area, but I can speak to it. So there have been changes in forest practices to recognize the many values of forests. So harvesting methods have changed, harvesting patterns have changed, and instead of very large and often square or rectangular cut blocks, now when forests are harvested, it's often at a much smaller scale of cutting area, and the shapes of those cut blocks are now designed to really fit the landscape much better. They also incorporate some portion of trees left, so you'll have groups of trees left for wildlife to diversify the landscape. After they've been reforested and those trees have grown for a few years, they look much more like the kinds of patterns you get over the long run from natural disturbances, like from a big wind throw event or from small fires and things like that. Here in the Faculty of Forestry, there's been a lot of work done on visualization of those impacts and better designs, but not so related to climate change.
Could you tell me about how the province of British Columbia has begun to approach reforestation through planting practices?
I think that the province of British Columbia has been a leader in thinking about how to adapt forest management to climate change, and they have a number of initiatives underway right now, but one of them is around climate-based seed transfer, so selecting what to plant based on what climates are expected in the next few decades, instead of just using the historical approach, which is local material. Foresters for hundreds of years have recognized that you need to match the trees you plant, not just the species, but the genetics of the trees that you plant, to the local environment. We're in the process of breaking away from that old rule of thumb, because local is no longer safest, because the local place is no longer the historic local climate. I think BC has shown a lot of leadership, and we're working to help inform that development of policy. There has been an increase in the diversity of planting, so there are more and more areas that are being planted with multiple species. Is there more to be done? Absolutely. One approach fits all isn't going to work, because we need to practice adaptive management, see what works in different places, experiment with different things, give foresters who are on the ground some latitude to try different things, and many of them are trying different things because they really care about what they put in the ground. They care about those forests. And we also, at the same time, we need very strong conservation strategies. We need to protect areas that we do not manage. We need to think about how we're going to help species migrate between areas that are protected. We need to think about protecting the biological legacy of old growth forests and some of the very old trees. Another initiative I'm involved in is the Big Tree Registry, where we track the largest trees in the province, and that's a citizen science approach. We ask the members of the public to when they find big trees, measure them, nominate them, and then we can add them to our database and track them over time and see how their health is faring in the face of these changes in climate.
In your experience, what have been some of the positive benefits of having regular people getting out into their forests, learning about them, and participating in their well-being?
I think it's really important, and again, there's this new area of research I'm not involved in that really speaks to the effect of forests and just trees in the urban forest on people's mental health, their speed of recovery from surgery, a sense of well-being. In Asia, there's a practice called forest bathing where people go out in the forest to heal. We need to be connected with nature, but with climate change, we also have to help nature. So getting people out in the forest, getting children out in the forest, getting people participating in projects, speaking to the public. The reason I agreed to talk to you is I feel it's very important that we talk about these issues and share ideas on what can be done and encourage people as well. We need to bring solutions to issues around climate change to people that are realistic but ambitious, and that will challenge us to do the right thing. And if we only talk about the problems and we don't talk about the solutions, it can bring about a sense of apathy and a sense that we can't do anything. There are actions we can take to modify forest management that will in turn have an impact on greenhouse gases. Now, do those substitute for mitigation? Absolutely not. We absolutely need action on climate right now from Canada at a global table, from all the other countries, with forests and with people's love of forests, and with the number of trees we already plant. We do have some opportunities to make a difference in the future health of those forests.
Well, Professor Aitken, we really appreciate the lessons that you've given us, but also that final point about engagement, bringing on a real and realistic hope for our future. So thank you for what you're doing, and thanks for giving us your time.
Thank you very much, and good luck with your project.